Good evening, my friend, and welcome, Elaren Nights. You are listening to a guided sleep story. My name is Ojit, and tonight it is my quiet privilege to be the gentle voice that accompanies you as you drift toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin the story, take a slow, deep breath in. As the story ends later, the soft sounds and calming music will continue to play, staying with you a little longer as you rest. I wish you a peaceful rest and a beautiful night's sleep. So let's start. Tonight I'm going to tell you a story about the library at the end of the quiet street. So listen to the full story. There is a street in a small, unhurried city where the trees grow old and patient, their roots lifting the edges of the sidewalk in gentle, rounded bumps. Their branches lean toward each other overhead. And in the evenings, when the streetlights flicker on one by one, the shadows of their leaves drift slowly across the pale pavement in a way that feels almost like breathing. The street has no particular name that anyone remembers, or perhaps it has a name and people simply forget to use it. The way you sometimes forget the name of a song that you have known for years, that you can hum perfectly but cannot quite say aloud. It is that kind of street. The kind that exists quietly, without insisting on itself. At the far end of the street, there is a library. It does not look like a grand building. The stone that makes up its walls is pale grey, worn smooth in places where the rain has been falling against it for a very long time. And the wooden door at the entrance is a deep, dark green, the colour of moss after a long rain. The color of something that has been growing slowly and contentedly for many years. There are wide stone steps leading up to this door. 4 of them, each one slightly uneven from use, worn in the center where so many feet have stepped. On either side of those steps there are 2 large clay pots, old and cracked in places. And in each pot grows a small round tree with leaves that are soft and dark and quiet. Someone has filled the cracks in the pots with a pale plaster that is drying to the color of cream. And somehow even those cracks look like they belong there, look like they are simply part of the building's long and gentle life. There is a small sign beside the door, hand-painted in terracotta red lettering, that is slightly uneven in a way that feels human and warm. The Halcyon Library. Open until 10 in the evening. All hours welcome. It was a Tuesday in late autumn when a young woman named Elara first walked down that street and noticed the warm glow of the library's windows. She had not been looking for it. She had not been looking for anything in particular, which is perhaps the truest way of saying that she had been looking for everything, or at least for something she could not name. She was walking the long way home because she did not quite want to go home yet, and this was not because anything was wrong with home. Home was fine. Home had her small apartment with its kettle and its window box of herbs and its soft grey sofa. But lately, home had also felt a little too quiet in a way that was different from comfortable quiet. It was a quiet that felt like something missing, like a word you meant to say before you could say it. Elara was 29 years old, and she worked as a copy editor for a small publishing company, which meant she spent her days reading other people's sentences and gently helping them become clearer. She liked her work. She found it satisfying in a careful, modest way, the way finding a lost button feels satisfying, or the way straightening a picture that has been slightly tilted on a wall feels satisfying. Small corrections, small improvements, quiet good. It was enough work for a quiet person, and she was, by nature, a quiet person. But lately there had been a feeling she could not quite name sitting somewhere in her chest, just below her collarbone. It was not pain exactly. It was more like the feeling of carrying something small in your coat pocket all day. Something that is not very heavy on its own, but heavy enough to pull the fabric slightly. Heavy enough to remind you it is there when you put your hand in. She had been carrying this feeling for some weeks now, maybe longer. She was not entirely sure when it had arrived. That was part of what made it strange. It had not arrived with a particular event or a particular day. It had simply been there one morning and then the next morning, and it had stayed. She was not unhappy in any dramatic sense. Nothing terrible had happened to her. There had been no great loss, no falling out with someone she loved, no sudden catastrophe. There had only been, gradually and quietly, a kind of tiredness that sleep did not entirely fix, a kind of loneliness that was not about being alone. She did not mind being alone. She was very used to it, but about something softer than that. A longing, perhaps, a sense of reaching for a feeling that was just slightly out of range. Not grief, not despair. Only the small, persistent ache of a person who is carrying on very well and is also somewhere underneath the carrying on, a little bit tired of carrying. And this particular Tuesday evening, she turned down the quiet street almost by accident, her feet choosing the turn while her mind was elsewhere, and she walked slowly between the old trees with her hands in her coat pockets, and she looked up and saw the warm amber light in those tall library windows. She stopped walking for a moment. She stood on the pavement and looked up at that light. Something in her chest did the smallest, quietest thing, like a bird adjusting its wings, like a single long breath that had been slightly held, finally beginning, very gently, to release. She read the sign. She climbed the 4 stone steps. She turned the round iron handle, and the old green door opened with a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a creak, the sound that old wood makes when it has been opened by thousands of different hands over many years and has become entirely comfortable with the motion. She stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the warmth, not the aggressive warmth of a room with the heat turned up too high, but a gentle enclosing warmth, the kind that settles over you the way a blanket does when someone lays it across you while you are sitting still. It was a warmth that felt welcoming rather than insistent. The air in the library smelled of paper. Thousands of pages, old and new, a smell she had always found more comforting than she could easily explain. There was something else in the air too, something faint and sweet. She thought it might be beeswax from the polished wooden furniture, or perhaps dried lavender from the small vase of it she could see on the reception desk, just inside the door. The entrance hall was not grand, but it was beautiful in the way that well-loved things are beautiful. Not because they are perfect, but because you can see how much they have been cared for over time. The floors were wide wooden boards, dark with age, and they gave slightly under her feet, just barely, in a way that was deeply reassuring. The give of something that has held the weight of many people for many years, and is quietly content to hold hers too. The reception desk was small and wooden, lit by a lamp with an amber shade that cast a warm pool of light across a blotter covered in neat handwriting, a small cup holding several pens, and beside the vase of dried lavender, a smooth flat stone that someone had placed there simply because it was pleasant to look at. There was no one at the reception desk, but Elara did not feel unwelcome. She felt somehow as though the library itself had answered the door, as though the warmth and the light and the smell of the paper were the library's way of saying, "Come in, come in. There is room for you here." Beyond the reception desk, the library opened into a series of connected rooms, and she could see the shelves from where she stood. Tall wooden shelves reaching nearly to the ceiling, filled with books of every size and color, not arranged in a cold, clinical way of a system that values organization above all else, but in a manner that suggested someone had thought about what looked right alongside what made sense. Books stood and leaned and were occasionally stacked sideways to fill a gap. Between the books there were small objects placed with quiet intention. A smooth grey stone here, a dried sprig of something there, a tiny painted figure of a sleeping fox tucked against the spine of a larger book. Small things, quiet still, pleasant things that caught the eye and held it gently for a moment before letting it move on. And everywhere there were lamps, Not overhead lights of the kind that fill a room evenly and brightly and coldly, but floor lamps with warm amber shades, table lamps with bases of painted ceramic, small brass reading lights attached at intervals along the shelves. The light in the library came from many directions and many heights, layering itself through the space in a way that had no sharp edges anywhere. There were no shadows that felt harsh or dark. The shadows here were soft and golden at their edges. The shadows of a room that has chosen warmth over brightness and has found in doing so that it has both. Elara stood just inside the entrance and breathed. She noticed after a moment that her shoulders had dropped, not dramatically, not as though some great held tension had suddenly released, but slightly, quietly, the way they might drop after a long day of sitting up straight when you finally allow yourself to settle. She had not known she was holding them up. She had been carrying them up near her ears, it seemed, for longer than she had realized. Now they simply rested where they belonged. She began to walk. She walked slowly along the first row of shelves, her right hand trailing lightly along the spines at the books. The spines were smooth and rough by turns, cloth and board and paper, some with embossed lettering, some with worn gold type that had faded to a warm whisper of itself. She did not read the titles carefully as she walked. She let her fingers and her eyes move at the same slow pace, not looking for anything in particular, simply moving, simply being in a place that asked nothing of her except that she walk at whatever pace felt right. There is something about walking through a library without any particular purpose that feels like a small private gift, without a list of titles you need to find, without a task to accomplish, without any agenda at all, just walking and looking and letting the long rows of books remind you, gently, that the world contains more stories and more understanding than any one person could ever read in a lifetime, and that this is not a sad fact, but a comforting one. There is always more. There is always another quiet hour, another warm room, another story you have not yet found. You will not run out. The world will not run out. She turned a corner between two tall shelves and found herself in a smaller room that branched off from the main hall. This room had a lower ceiling than the rest of the library, and it felt more contained, more intimate. It had two deep-set windows through which the darkness of the autumn evening was visible outside, a darkness that was not frightening but simply the honest darkness of a late night, still and patient and holding the world gently while it rested. The windows were flanked by curtains in a deep blue-green, the color of still water in the late evening, and they were drawn halfway, softening the blackness of the sky into something muffled and safe. In this small room, there were 3 armchairs. They were large and old, upholstered in a fabric that had faded from what might once have been a rich burgundy to a softer, dustier rose. The kind of color that fabric becomes when it has been sat in many times over many years and has taken on, in its fading, a quality that new fabric does not have. Each chair had a small side table beside it, and each table had a lamp. One of the chairs was occupied by an elderly man who was asleep, a book open across his chest, rising and falling gently with his breathing. His face was deeply lined and entirely peaceful, the face of someone who has made his peace with many things and carries them now with ease. She looked at him for a moment, this sleeping man in his faded chair, and something moved through that she could not name. Not pity, not exactly, but something like tenderness, something like recognition, as though the sight of him sleeping peacefully in this warm room was a small, wordless reminder that rest was possible. That the body knows how to let go when you give it permission. She chose the chair nearest the window and sat down. The chair received her the way good chairs receive people, not stiffly, not so softly that you feel you might disappear into it, but with a firm and comfortable embrace, the embrace of something that has been sat in many times and has shaped itself, slightly, over the years, to the general shape of a person at rest. The arms were at exactly the right height, The back was at exactly the right height. She settled into it and felt again that quiet settling of her own body, that small and gentle easing. She rested her hands in her lap and looked out at the dark window. The trees outside moved in the slight night wind, their bare branches tracing slow patterns against the glow of the distant streetlights. They moved the way things move in water, with a kind of yielding, a kind of patience. They did not resist the wind and they did not rush with it. They simply moved as they were moved, and then settled, and then moved again, back and forth lightly, continuously, without any urgency at all. She watched them for a while. She did not think about anything in particular, or rather she thought about many small things, the way the mind moves when it is beginning to slow down. A thought about her work, then a thought about what she might have for breakfast tomorrow, then a thought about a conversation she had had 3 days ago that she had not quite finished thinking about, then nothing, just the trees, then the lamplight on the side table beside her, then the sound of the sleeping man breathing, then nothing again. Her own breathing had slowed. She had not tried to slow it. The room had its own pace and she had simply, without noticing, begun to move at the same pace as everything else in it. The small, heavy thing in her chest was still there, but it was sitting differently now, less like a stone and more like something that had been a stone and was beginning, very slowly, to remember that it was something softer. After a while, she was not sure how long, time moved differently here. Her eyes moved to the side table beside her chair. There was a lamp on it, as she had noted, and beside the lamp there was a book. A small book with a plain cloth cover, the color of pale sage green. There was no title on the cover, or if there had been one once, it had worn away entirely over the years. The book looked old, but not fragile, the kind of old that comes from being read many times, from being carried in pockets and held in warm hands and left on side tables in libraries for other people to find. She picked it up. It was light in her hands. She opened it to the middle, the way people sometimes open books when they are not looking for anything in particular, when they are simply opening a door and seeing what is on the other side. The page she opened to had a short passage written in a simple, unhurried hand. Not a poem exactly, and not quite prose. Something in between, something that did not seem concerned with being one thing or another. You do not have to understand your sadness in order to be kind to it. You do not have to know why you were tired in order to rest. Sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is simply sit in a warm room, hold a quiet breath, and allow themselves to be exactly as they are, incomplete, uncertain, and somehow still enough. She read the words twice. Then she sat with him for a moment, the book open in her lap, looking not at the page but at the lamplight on the wall. She thought about that word, enough. She thought about how rarely she applied it to herself and how easily she applied it to other things, other people. A meal could be enough. A conversation could be enough. A day's work could be enough. But she herself, the person who had done the work and eaten the meal and had the conversation, she rarely arrived at that word. There was always something more she felt she should have done, should have said, should have been, always some slight deficit somewhere that she carried with her into the next day. And yet, reading those words in this warm and quiet room, with the sleeping man breathing nearby and the branches moving slowly beyond the glass, the word enough felt like it might, just possibly, also belong to her, that she might, without anything changing, without any improvement or correction or achievement, simply be sitting here and be enough. It was not a dramatic realization. It did not arrive with any particular force. It was more like noticing after a long time of not noticing that the window was open slightly and that the air coming in was fresh. She closed the book gently and held it in her lap for a moment longer, and then she set it back on the side table. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the window. She looked at her own hands resting in her lap. She stayed. After some more time had passed, she truly had no sense of how much. She heard the softest sound from the direction of the main room, a sound that was nothing more than a chair being settled into, or a book being set down on a table, the quietest possible evidence of another person being alive somewhere nearby. She was not startled by it. She was, if anything, comforted by it. The awareness of another human presence somewhere in the warm library, living their own quiet Tuesday evening, carrying whatever they carried, resting in whatever way they needed to rest. She rose slowly from her chair, moving the way you move in a library, with care, with quietness, and made her way back through the small room and into the main hall. There was a woman at one of the reading tables near the center of the hall. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair cut close to her head, and a pair of reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had a large book open in front of her, and she was reading with total absorption, her chin resting lightly on one hand, her eyes moving steadily across the page. She looked like someone who had been reading in libraries for her entire life, and had long since ceased to notice that she was doing it. It was simply where she was, simply what she was doing, as natural as breathing. There was also, at a small desk in a far corner, a young man who appeared to be writing something. He was perhaps 17 or 18, with dark curly hair falling across his forehead, and he was writing steadily and slowly in a notebook with a soft pencil, pausing occasionally to look up at nothing in particular, looking at the middle distance, the way writers look when they are searching for the right word, and the word is somewhere just out of reach in the warm air. He would look up, hold the stillness for a moment, and then look back down and write again. She watched him briefly, with a kind of quiet affection for the sight of a person doing a careful and private thing. She moved along the shelves again, more slowly now. She ran her fingertips along the spines of books in a different section, and the titles came to her in small offerings, one after another, like gifts laid quietly on a step, a geography of quiet places, the language of simple things, notes on resting, in praise of ordinary days. They were not books she had heard of before, but she did not stop to take them down. She simply let their titles rest in her mind for a moment, the way you let a hand rest briefly on your shoulder, just long enough to feel the weight of it, just long enough to feel acknowledged. She came to a part of the library she had not yet explored, a corridor between two very tall shelves that led to a back room she had not noticed before. The corridor was narrow enough that the shelves on either side came close enough that she could have touched both at once by extending her arms. She walked down it slowly, and the books on either side seemed to lean slightly inward as she passed. Or perhaps that was simply the way tall shelves look when you were standing between them and looking up. They always seem to be very slightly leaning in, very slightly reaching toward each other. The way people in a quiet conversation lean very slightly toward the person they are listening to. The back room was smaller still than the small room with the armchairs. It had no windows. It had a low ceiling and wooden walls, and it smelled more intensely of old paper than anywhere else in the library. There were no lamps here, but there were candles, actual candles in simple glass holders on every surface, their light soft and warm and moving just slightly with the slow circulation of the air. The effect was extraordinary, though not in a dramatic way. It was extraordinary the way a very quiet thing can sometimes be extraordinary, the way a single note played on an instrument in a small still room can be more moving than a whole orchestra in a large hall. The room was made entirely of candlelight and old paper and silence, and it felt, there was no other word for it, sacred. Not in a religious sense, but in the older sense of the word, the sense of something that is simply set apart, held separate from the hurry and the noise and the ordinary business of getting through a day, a space that exists to remind you that it is possible to simply be. There were cushions on the floor here instead of chairs, large and thick, in the same deep blue-green as the curtains in the other room, and a few of them were arranged near the middle of the floor in a loose circle. She sat down on one. She crossed her legs, and cushion received her with the same quiet welcome that everything in this library seemed to offer, and she sat in the candlelight and was still. She was not thinking now, not truly thinking, not in the sense of following a thread of thought from one place to another. She was present in the way that you are present when you are very tired and have finally allowed yourself to stop. When the body says enough moving now and the mind for once agrees. The candles moved their soft light around the room, and the room was full of the smell of old books, and there was no sound at all except the very faint sound of the building itself, the tiny creaks and sighs that old buildings make, not from distress, but simply from being alive, from being full of warm air on a cold night, from existing solidly and patiently in the world. She thought about the passage she had read in the little green book. You do not have to understand your sadness in order to be kind to it. She sat with those words again in the candlelight, and she let herself be kind to it. She let herself acknowledge, without drama and without the need to fix anything, that she had been carrying a weight, that she was tired, that somewhere along the way she had begun holding her breath slightly, metaphorically, had begun moving through her days with a kind of braced quality, a small, persistent guardedness, as though she were always preparing just slightly for something to require more of her than she had, and she had not known she was doing it. She'd simply been doing it, the way you carry a bag for so long that you stop feeling its weight and only notice it is gone when you finally set it down. Sitting here in the candlelight among the old books and the quiet, she began, very gently, to set it down. Not completely, not all at once. She did not feel the sudden lifting of a great burden or the sudden arrival of relief so powerful it made her want to cry. It was quieter than that and more honest than that. It was the simple, small recognition that she was tired and that being tired was all right. That she was lonely in a soft and ordinary way, and that this was also all right. That she did not need to have everything resolved and understood in order to be at peace right now, in this moment, in this room. The peace was not contingent on having things figured out. The peace was simply available. It was here, in this room, and she was in this room, and that was enough. That word again, enough. She breathed slowly and the candles moved, and the room was still. After she had sat in the candle room for a time she could not measure, she rose quietly and made her way back through the narrow corridor and into the main hall of the library. The elderly man from the armchair room had woken and was gone. Or perhaps he had not gone but had moved to another part of the library, settling into another chair with his book, continuing some long and private reading. The woman with the silver hair was still at her table, still absorbed, still moving her eyes steadily across the page. The young man in the corner had stopped writing and was resting his head on his arms on the desk, not asleep, just resting. His eyes half closed, looking at the grain of the wood table with the unfocused look of someone who has done enough for now and is content to simply exist for a few minutes before doing anything more. Elara walked to a section of the shelves she had not yet visited and stood before it for a moment, looking up at the rows of books without choosing any of them. She was not looking for a book, she was simply standing among them, and it was enough to stand among them, to be surrounded by so many accumulated thoughts and feelings, so many human attempts to put the inner life into words, to make meaning out of experience, to say, here is what it was like to be alive, here is what I noticed, here is what I felt and thought and struggled with and found beautiful. All of it gathered here in this warm room, all of it waiting quietly for anyone who needed it. she thought, standing there, about all the people who had written the books on these shelves. Not their names or their stories, but simply the fact of them. The fact that every single one of those books had been written by a person who had, at some point, felt something strongly enough to want to say it, had felt lonely, or joyful, or puzzled, or moved by something small and ordinary, had noticed the way light falls through a window in the early morning, had wanted, deeply, to tell someone about it. Every book on every shelf in every library in the world was, at its heart, a person saying, "I felt this. Did you ever feel this too?" And every person who read it was saying back, silently, across time and distance, "Yes, yes, I did. I feel it too." She was not alone, she thought. Not really. Not in any deep or permanent sense. She was surrounded right now by the voices of thousands and thousands of people who had felt what she felt, who had carried the same small weights, who had been tired in the same way and lonely in the same soft and ordinary way, and who had written about it or read about it and had found in the writing and the reading some small measure of comfort. She was part of a long, quiet human conversation that had been going on for as long as people had been alive. A conversation not about grand events or dramatic turning points, but about the daily inner weather of being a person, being alive, being tired, being hopeful, being uncertain. She was not alone. The thoughts settled in her chest, gently, where the small heavy thing had been. She found her way to a window seat she had not noticed before, tucked into a deep alcove between two shelves near the front of the library. The window seat had a padded cushion in a soft cream color, and there was a folded blanket at one end, a thick, soft blanket in a warm green plaid, and a reading lamp at the other end. She sat in the window seat and drew her legs up and pulled the blanket across her lap without thinking, the way you do things in warm and safe places, by instinct, without needing to decide. She leaned her back against the wall of the alcove and looked out the window at the street outside. It was dark now, full dark, the dark of late evening, the dark that comes after the last purple-grey light has faded from the sky and left only the black of a clear November night. The streetlights illuminated small circles of pavement, and the bare branches of the trees moved in those small circles, lit from below, gold-edged in the amber light. The street was empty. There was no one walking on it. The world outside was quiet in the way that cities become quiet late in the evening. Not silent, not entirely. There was still the very distant sound of a car somewhere several streets away, and somewhere further still the faint tolling of a clock, 3 soft, low notes, but quiet enough that you could feel the difference between the inside and the outside. Feel the warmth of the library as a distinct and real thing compared to the cold darkness just beyond the glass. She looked at the glass. She looked at her own faint reflection in it. She looked like herself, she thought, which was a simple thought, but a true one. She looked like a person sitting in a warm window seat in a library at night, with a blanket on her lap and lamps behind her, and her face in the dark glass was soft and at rest and quite familiar to her. Sometimes she barely recognized herself in mirrors. Or not that she did not recognize herself, but that the person she saw looked a little like a person who was trying very hard, who was pulling themselves carefully together each morning and carrying it through the day. Tonight in the dark window, she just looked like herself, a person at rest. She stayed in the window seat for a long time. She did not read, she did not think particularly. She looked at the street and the trees and the night, and she breathed, and the blanket was warm across her legs, and the lamp made a pool of amber light around her, and the library was full of its own soft, inhabited silence, the occasional sound of a page turning in another room, the almost inaudible sound of the woman at the reading table quietly closing her large book and opening it again to a different section, the distant tick somewhere of a clock she could not see. small sounds, human sounds. The sounds of a place that is alive and at rest at the same time. She thought about tomorrow, not with anxiety, not with the braced preparedness that had been coloring her thoughts for weeks, but in a softer way. Tomorrow would come. She would wake in her apartment and make tea in her kettle and look out her kitchen window, and then she would go to work and read sentences and make small corrections, and it would be a day, an ordinary day, and she would carry through it whatever she carried. But perhaps she would carry it differently. Perhaps she would remember at some point during the ordinary day the feeling of sitting in this window seat and remember that it was possible to put things down for a while, to sit in a warm room with a blanket and let the night be the night outside the glass, while she was simply in here, simply warm, simply present. Perhaps that was all she needed to remember. She turned her head and looked back into the library. The reading lamps burned their steady amber light. The shelves rose toward the ceiling, full and patient and still. The silver-haired woman had finally gathered her things. She was placing her reading glasses back into a soft case, folding a piece of paper into the front of her book to mark her place, moving with the unhurried ease of someone who has no reason to hurry. The young man was gone from his corner desk. Gone quietly and without Elara noticing the moment of his going, leaving only the chair pushed slightly back and a notebook on the corner of the table. The library was emptier now than it had been, the hour growing late, the world outside growing deeper into its quiet. She looked at the library and felt simply and without drama, grateful for it, grateful for the warmth, grateful for the light, grateful for the books and the quiet and the cushions on the floor and the candles in the back room and the old man who had been sleeping peacefully in his chair and the silver-haired woman reading with complete absorption and the young man with his notebook and his soft pencil, grateful for all of it, for this place that existed simply to hold people, simply to be a warm and quiet room where people could come and rest and read and sit and, if they needed to, let something go. She was not sure exactly when the small heavy thing in her chest finished softening, because it did not happen all at once. It happened the way all real things happen, gradually and without announcement. She was sitting in the window seat with her blanket and her lamp, and she was looking at the night outside. And at some point she noticed that the weight she had been aware of, below her collarbone, the thing she had been carrying without quite knowing she was carrying it, was simply lighter, not gone entirely, not transformed into happiness or relief, but lighter, less dense, like something that has been held very tightly and is now held more gently, more loosely, with open hands instead of closed ones. She thought about what had made it lighter. She thought about the old green book and its passage about being kind to your sadness. She thought about the candle room and its circle of cushions and its complete and patient silence. She thought about the branches moving in the lamplight outside the window. She thought about the sleeping man and the reading woman and the writing boy. She thought about all the books on all the shelves and all the people who had written them, all of them saying, "I felt this too, I felt it too." And she thought simply and quietly that she had needed to be in a place that asked nothing of her except that she be here. And she had found such a place, by accident, or by some quality of her feet choosing the right street on a Tuesday in autumn. And she had been here in this warm and gentle building for some hours, and she had sat and read, and breathed, and rested, and watched the trees, and held a blanket, and her chest was lighter. That was all. That was the whole of it. There was no magic in it except the quiet magic of a warm room and a little time and the willingness to be still. She looked at her hands in her lap. They were relaxed, she noticed, open, palms slightly upward, the fingers loosely curled. She could not remember the last time she had looked at her hands and found them completely at rest, not holding anything, not preparing to hold anything, just resting with their own quiet weight in her lap. She stayed a little longer. When she finally rose to leave, the library was very nearly empty. The silver-haired woman had gone. The reading lamps still burned steadily at their posts. The shelves still rose in their patient rows. The clock she could not see had, in the past little while, chimed the soft notes of 9 o'clock, and then had settled back into silence. She folded the green plaid blanket and left it on the window seat cushion where she had found it. She stood for a moment with her hand still resting on the soft fabric of it, looking at the library one more time, at the amber light and the tall shelves and the warm wooden floors with their slight, reassuring give, at the small side table with the little green book still resting on it in the armchair room, just visible through the doorway, at the dried lavender in the vase on the reception desk. She thought, "I will come back," and she knew it was true. Not as a plan or a resolution or an intention she would need to hold on to, but simply as a fact, the way it is, a fact that you will go back to a place where you felt at ease. You do not need to remind yourself. Your body knows. Your feet will remember the way. She walked to the door. She turned the round iron handle. The door opened with its soft and sighing sound, and the cold air of the November night came in at once, clean and cold and still, the air of a night that has been quiet for a long time and intends to go on being quiet. She stood in the doorway for a moment, between the warmth of the library and the cool of the night, and she breathed both of them in at once. Then she stepped out and walked down the four-worn stone steps, past the clay pots with their small round trees, and onto the pavement of the quiet street. The walk home was slow. She did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. The street was quiet and empty, and the trees moved in their slow and patient way above her, and the streetlights made their soft circles on the pavement ahead of her, and she walked through them one by one, her hands in her coat pockets, her shoulders at their natural height, her breathing steady and deep and unhurried. The night was cold, but not unpleasantly so. It was the kind of cold that feels clean, that makes the air feel like something substantial, like something worth breathing rather than simply something you breathe because you must. She could see her breath in the lamplight, soft white puffs that appeared and dissolved in seconds, each one gone before the next arrived, each one perfectly complete in itself. She thought about the passage from the little green book. She thought about it not as a thing to be analyzed or held up to the light and examined, but in the way you carry a simple, true thing, loosely, easily, aware that it is with you without needing to keep checking that it is still there. You do not have to understand your sadness in order to be kind to it. She was kind to it, she thought, whatever it was. The tiredness, the soft loneliness, the vague and persistent ache of a person trying hard and feeling, sometimes, that the trying is done in an empty room. She was kind to it. She would be kind to it tomorrow too, and the day after. Not because kindness to oneself was easy. It was not. She knew it required practice and patience and forgetting and starting again. But because she had been reminded tonight that it was possible, that there were warm rooms in the world, and quiet streets, and old chairs that received you without judgment, and books that said the things you needed to hear in exactly the right simple words. The world was not as indifferent as it sometimes felt. It had, quietly, in ways you might walk past without noticing, arranged warmth for you. If you turned down the right street on a Tuesday evening, if you pushed open the right dark green door. She turned onto her own street. She walked up to her building and unlocked the door and climbed the stairs to her apartment. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook inside the door. She filled her kettle and set it to boil. She moved through the small familiar rooms of her home slowly, touching things lightly as she passed them, the back of the sofa, the edge of the kitchen table, the sill of the window where her herbs were growing in their small pots. The apartment felt different to her, not because it had changed, but because she had. not dramatically, only slightly, only by the small degree that an evening in a warm library with a blanket and a candle room and a little sage green book can shift a person. But the slight degree was real. She stood at the kitchen window while the kettle heated and looked out at the city. The city was doing what it always did, existing, continuing, holding its millions of quiet and ordinary lives in its streets and its buildings and its lit windows. Out there, right now, other people were sitting in window seats and reading books and writing in notebooks and sleeping in chairs. Other people were carrying small weights below their collarbones that they could not quite name. Other people were walking down quiet streets and looking up at warm amber light in a library window and feeling something lift, just barely, just slightly, like a bird adjusting its wings. The world was full of people carrying ordinary sadnesses and setting them down in whatever warm rooms they could find. She was one of them, and that was not a sad thing. The kettle boiled and she made her tea, and she took it to the sofa and sat down and pulled the grey blanket across her lap. Not the green plaid one from the library, but her own soft grey one. And she held her warm cup in both hands, and she looked at the ceiling of her apartment, and then she closed her eyes. She did not think about anything in particular. She breathed. The tea was warm in her hands, and the blanket was soft across her legs, and the apartment was quiet in the way it always was. But the quiet felt different now, not like absence, not like something missing, just quiet. Just the honest and comfortable quiet of a room at rest. Outside, the city moved through its night. Somewhere several streets away, the clock chimed again. 10 soft, low, evenly spaced notes, the last of them settling into the air and then dissolving. 10 o'clock. The halcyon library would be closing now, or would have just closed, the amber lamps still lit perhaps for a few more minutes. The door locked, the books left alone in the dark to be still and quiet and entirely themselves until the morning. The reading table empty, the armchairs resting, the candle room dark and cool, the window seat with its green plaid blanket folded on the cushion, waiting with perfect patience for whoever might need it next. She thought of the library, briefly and warmly, the way you think of a place you feel, the way you think of something that belongs to you, not because you own it, but because it has become part of the way you understand the world. And then she stopped thinking and only breathed, in and out, slow and steady. The way the trees had moved, the way the candle flames had moved, the way everything in that warm and patient building had moved, with ease, with gentleness, without urgency or effort, simply following the rhythm that was already there, the quiet rhythm underneath everything, the rhythm you can hear when the noise fades and the room grows still, in and out. The weight below her collarbone was gone now, or very nearly gone, dissolved so gradually during the course of the evening that she could not have said exactly when it had left, could not have named the moment, could only notice its absence, the way you notice the absence of a sound that has been playing for so long in the background that you stopped hearing it. Now there was simply the quiet, and the quiet was not empty, it was full of warmth and of rest, and of the small, true knowledge that she was all right, that she had been all right all along perhaps, even while she was carrying the weight, that the weight was simply what it was, ordinary human tiredness, ordinary human longing, not a flaw or a failing, but simply the honest condition of a person living carefully and trying her best. She was all right. She was enough. She held her tea in both hands, and her eyes were closed, and the apartment was quiet, and the city was quiet, and the night was deepening around everything, around the buildings and the streets and the bare branch trees, around the small library at the end of the quiet street, its dark green door locked, its books resting in their places, its lamps cooling slowly from the amber warmth to the plain dark of a sleeping room. The night held all of it, gently and without preference. The busy and the still, the lit and the dark, the weighted and the light. It held it all with equal patience. It asked nothing of any of it. It simply was what it was and let each thing be what it was. She breathed in and out, slower now. The city grew quieter still, the last sounds of it receding the way sounds do, when the hour grows late and the world begins, one corner at a time, to give itself over to rest. A door closing somewhere, muffled and distant, a car passing on a fast street, its sound fading smoothly into nothing, the wind moving through the trees along the quiet street, and the trees moving with it, and the lamplight touching the tips of the branches, and the branches returning to stillness. And in the halcyon library, in the small back room with the cushions on the floor, there might still have been one candle burning, just one, in its small glass holder, its flame standing upright and steady in the stillness of the closed room, casting its small warm light across the spines of the books on the surrounding shelves. The light touching the titles one after another, a geography of quiet places, the language of simple things, notes on resting, in praise of ordinary days, touching them gently and moving on, the way a kind thought moves through a tired mind at the end of a long and honest day. And in her apartment, on her sofa with her warm tea and her grey blanket, Elara breathed in and out, and the night held everything kindly, and everything rested. Sleep now. You have carried enough today. The library is still there, at the end of the quiet street, whenever you need it. The door is the color of moss after rain. The lamps are warm. The chairs are waiting. You are enough exactly as you are, right now, in this moment. Rest.